When the British Empire expanded across continents, it did not only send soldiers and ships. It also sent words, ideas, and arguments. Arguments that claimed conquest was necessary. Arguments that made power sound like protection. Arguments that turned ambition into destiny. From the early 1600s to the late 1800s, Britain presented a story that made empire seem justified. A story that said conquest was civilization. A story that said expansion was responsibility. This is how Britain justified conquest. Hello and welcome. I hope you are having a peaceful moment today, and thank you for joining me on this journey into history. Today we look not at the battles or the borders, but at the beliefs behind them. How Britain explained its expansion to the world, and to itself. Some said empire brought progress. Some said empire brought protection. Others saw something very different. They saw control, pressure, inequality, and the loss of independence. So here is something to think about before we begin. Was conquest justified by purpose, or simply explained by power? A mission of trade 1600 to 1700. The story begins with a promise. In the early 17th century, Britain claimed it did not seek empire, only opportunity. It was a nation arriving late to a world already shaped by Portuguese and Dutch networks of commerce. Britain had no vast armies overseas, no towering fleets of conquest, no official ambition to rule foreign lands. What it had instead were merchants, investors, and the quiet belief that profit could build a future greater than force. In 1600, the East India Company was created. It emerged not as a government institution, but as a commercial venture supported by shareholders. Its founding papers spoke of trade, wealth, and competitive opportunity. Ships were equipped to sail eastward in search of spices, silk, and markets that had operated for centuries without British involvement. There were no plans for rule. No declarations of conquest. Only the expectation that commerce would open doors that politics had not yet touched. Trading posts were built in India, the Spice Islands, and the Persian Gulf. Small compounds of warehouses and offices stood on borrowed land, permitted by agreements with local rulers. Merchants arrived with silver and left with cargo that could reshape fortunes at home. This was the mission of trade. But trade is rarely simple for long. Competition sharpened as other European powers fought for access to the same markets. Ships were intercepted. Warehouses were looted. Alliances shifted with the tides. In this world of risk and rivalry, the company demanded protection. A trading post became a fortified post. Walls rose. Gates appeared. Guards were hired. The promise of harmless commerce gained its first edge. Forts became necessary, or so the argument went. Without them, trade could not survive. Without protection, investment could not grow. Security became justification. Officials in London agreed to fund defensive measures. Investors were told that their money needed safeguarding. The forts expanded, and with them came the arrival of soldiers. They were first presented as escorts, then as garrisons, then as instruments of stability. As soldiers settled into these posts, authority grew around them. Officers negotiated with local leaders. Agreements were enforced with the presence of armed men. The people who had come only to buy and sell began to direct how others could trade. Certain ports were favored. Certain partners were excluded. The Compagnie's representatives became mediators, then supervisors, then decision-makers. Soldiers gained authority, even if no one had openly requested it. In time, the line between commerce and control blurred. Forts required supplies. Supplies required agreements. Agreements required influence. Influence required power. The mission of trade evolved, reshaping itself one decision at a time. A request for security became a claim of responsibility. A claim of responsibility became a right to intervene. Intervention became habit. In India, warehouses turned into fortified compounds. In the Spice Islands, business negotiations involved threats from rival European companies. In the Persian Gulf, the company acted as both merchant and political agent. Its representatives learned that trade alone could not secure their position. They needed leverage. They needed to be more than visitors. They needed to be unavoidable. Back in London, the change was barely visible to the public. The story of overseas ventures was told in the language of profit and progress. Ships returning home carried pepper, textiles, and news of expanding opportunities. Investors toasted to successful voyages. Officials quietly accepted that the company was becoming something larger than originally intended. A private corporation now held the power to shape foreign relationships. And the crown allowed it, because the benefits flowed home. The mission that began with trade now demanded administration. Rules were written to govern company employees. Procedures were created to manage ports. Discounts, tariffs, and contracts became political tools. Local leaders who cooperated received advantages. Those who resisted were described as obstacles to progress. Conquest began with the argument of security. The company did not declare empire. But it practiced the habits that would build one. It trained soldiers. It negotiated like a government. It collected information like a diplomatic network. It learned how to apply pressure without appearing to seize control. Yet it was real. By the mid-17th century, the mission of trade had transformed its purpose. What began as a search for markets evolved into the creation of footholds. What began as cooperation evolved into the shaping of local conditions. The company became a shadow state, operating between commerce and governance. The British Crown benefited quietly. The merchants benefited loudly. The people living around the trading posts carried the consequences. Territory was still in the distance, but the logic of empire was now in place. Trade required forts. Forts required soldiers. Soldiers required authority. Authority required obedience. The next century would turn these conditions into more permanent control, but the foundations were laid here, in a period when Britain insisted it sought opportunity, not domination. By 1700, the world that Britain entered a century earlier no longer looked the same. Markets had been disrupted. Alliances had shifted. Trade routes now carried the weight of strategy rather than simple commerce. The British presence was no longer temporary. It was embedded. Trade required forts. Forts required soldiers. Soldiers required authority. A mission of trade had become something else. Not by declaration, but by evolution. Not through grand speeches, but through small steps that accumulated into power. The century ends with a question left unspoken in London and unanswered overseas. If trade now required authority to survive, how far would authority go to protect it? The answer would come in time. But the transformation began here, between 1600 and 1700, when the first seeds of conquest were planted in the soil of commerce, and empire grew from the argument of security. Between 1700 and 1700, a new way of speaking about empire emerged in Britain. It was a language that framed expansion not as conquest, but as improvement. Politicians, company officials, and commentators argued that overseas regions required guidance, structure, and reform. They claimed that British administration would bring economic growth, stability, and order. This language appeared in speeches delivered to Parliament, in private letters exchanged between investors, and in legal documents establishing authority in distant territories. It created the impression that expansion was an act of responsibility rather than ambition. The idea rested on the belief that distant economies needed foreign direction. British thinkers argued that trade could not flourish without restructuring. Ports needed regulation. Land needed surveying. Markets needed oversight. These arguments became tools that supported the decisions to intervene. They reflected a worldview in which improvement was defined from the perspective of the empire, not from the perspective of the people affected by it. The claim was simple. British control would transform overseas regions into more efficient, productive, and profitable territories. This language gave expansion a moral tone. It suggested that empire was not simply about resources or revenue. It promised that local systems would benefit from integration into wider commercial networks. Formal reports described territories as underused or unorganized. They portrayed administration as a gift of structure. Maps and plans showed land divided into grid lines, as if the future could be drawn on paper before it existed in reality. These documents helped create a framework in which intervention seemed necessary. In London, this approach influenced how decisions were made. Investors listened to presentations from company representatives who described overseas opportunities as projects of improvement. They discussed plantations, ports, and trading posts as ventures that would elevate commerce on both sides of the ocean. Coffee houses and offices became places where expansion was planned with a tone of obligation. This softened criticism and built consensus. Legal systems incorporated the idea as well. Charters establishing authority in foreign territories often included claims of public benefit. They spoke of justice, administration, and economic reform. Foreign communities were described as needing guidance, while British leadership was portrayed as capable and protective. These documents did not simply grant rights. They justified them. They turned control into an advertised necessity. Even when the goal was profit, the language made it sound like assistance. For many who used this rhetoric, improvement meant alignment with British systems. It meant changing agricultural practices to suit export markets. It meant reorganizing trade to pass through British shipping routes. It meant adopting legal and financial structures modeled on those of London. But they also displaced traditions that had existed long before. The language of improvement concealed these shifts beneath the vocabulary of progress. This justification spread through pamphlets and essays. Writers argued that regions with different customs would benefit from European models of administration. They described the world as uneven and claimed that empire was a way to balance it. These arguments rarely acknowledged that the benefits favored the imperial center. They ignored the possibility that improvement might not be a universal concept. Instead, they assumed that progress could be measured only in the terms that Britain valued. The language of improvement helped expansion move forward without appearing aggressive. It shaped public perception. Listeners heard not of conquest, but of responsibility. Not of imposed control, but of guidance. It claimed to offer roads, ports, and markets. It promised education and efficiency. It suggested that regions would become stronger under British direction. These claims did not always reflect reality, but they made policy easier to defend. In practice, improvement often meant redirection. Trade routes that once served regional markets now flowed outward. When resistance appeared, officials framed it as misunderstanding rather than objection, as if refusal were a failure to recognize progress. The language shaped not only decisions, but interpretation. It allowed officials to view dissent without questioning their systems. By the 1730s, this rhetoric had become a standard part of how policy was explained. It appeared in the preambles of commercial charters. It guided parliamentary discussions about the role of companies overseas. It influenced diplomatic correspondence. The argument became so familiar that it no longer sounded like argument. It sounded like common sense. Expansion seemed logical. Oversight seemed necessary. Opportunity seemed mutual, even when it was not. The effect reached beyond politics. It formed part of cultural identity. Many people in Britain came to believe that the empire was a civilizing force. They associated British presence abroad with improvement, even if they had never seen the places being described. This belief shaped expectations. It allowed expansion to continue with emotional support as well as financial support. It created a story in which the empire helped the world, and the world welcomed that help. By 1750, the language of improvement had become an essential tool of imperial growth. It built a narrative that transformed ambition into allowed expansion to proceed under the claim of created a justification that softened the edges of and it ensured that the empire did not speak only. It spoke in terms of progress. This era marked the beginning of an argument that would echo through later centuries. That control was a form of help. That administration was a gift. That expansion was a duty. These claims were persuasive because they offered reassurance. They suggested that power could be benevolent. But beneath the language, the structure of empire remained unchanged. It expanded to benefit the center. It grew through systems of advantage. And it used the language of improvement to explain why. Between 1700 and 1750, justification became strategy. Words became tools. The empire spoke of improvement. And in doing so, it created a story that made power sound like purpose. In 1757, on the fields near Plassey, a short battle created a long shadow. The East India Company emerged victorious, and with that victory came a new reality. Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions in Asia, now stood under company influence. A trading corporation, built to exchange goods and negotiate commercial terms, began to act as a ruler. What happened that year marked a turning point. Trade did not disappear, but it no longer stood alone. It was joined by authority. Before Plassey, the company operated within Bengal as a guest, granted trading privileges through negotiation. Ships arrived at its ports, merchants moved goods through its markets, and taxes were paid to local rulers. After 1757, the balance changed. The company gained access to revenue, land administration, and military command. It no longer waited for approval. It issued instructions. It did not request order. It created it. The explanation for this shift arrived quickly. Company officials insisted they were protecting Bengal from instability. They argued that interference was necessary, that administration was a duty, not a choice. They spoke of safeguarding trade and ensuring peace. But with every official report, with every justification, the territory they governed grew larger. Revenue increased. Taxes expanded. The money collected from Bengal funded the Compania's activities, not only in India but around the empire. Forts were strengthened. Armies were supplied. Each step deeper into governance required more income, and each increase in income required a justification. The arguments grew in scale with the revenues themselves. Bengal's cities felt the change. Calcutta developed into an administrative center. Offices where merchants once signed contracts now housed clerks, officers, and accounting departments. Paperwork replaced negotiation. Rules spread from desks where decisions were made thousands of miles from those who followed them. Maps marked not only ports but districts. Revenue charts listed not only goods but people. In the countryside, taxation became a defining force. Farmers who once dealt with local authorities now encountered company agents carrying ledgers and orders. Harvests that fed nearby towns were redirected to meet demands from overseas. Grain, cotton, silk, and saltpetre were measured not only for value but for what they could supply to a growing system. The flow of goods changed direction. It did not stay where it was produced. It traveled outward. The company described this process as improvement. They referred to efficiency, organization, and modernization. They explained their actions as prevention, as protection, as responsibility. The language of governance sounded like the language of guardianship. Yet each change brought more control into company hands. Protection became administration. Administration became rule. Bengal's wealth supported more than local governance. It financed global ambition. The company paid soldiers who expanded its reach. It paid officials who negotiated new treaties. It paid for buildings, docks, and warehouses that turned ports into hubs of imperial logistics. Decisions made in Bengal shaped outcomes in London, Madras, and beyond. The region had become a financial center of something much larger than itself. In Britain, company success was celebrated as enterprise. Newspapers described expansion as progress. Investors saw opportunity. Officials returning from India purchased estates. Their fortunes influenced society and politics. The company became a force that extended into parliament and social life. The story told in Britain was one of triumph and skill. But the story unfolding in Bengal was more complex. The justification continued. When authority expanded, officials claimed they were preventing disorder. When taxes rose, they claimed the fund supported stability. When trade routes were redirected, they claimed efficiency demanded it. Each phrase supported the next decision. We are protecting Bengal. We are preserving order. We are guiding development. Yet tension grew quietly. Markets that once flourished under regional networks now shifted under company priorities. Artisans faced changing requirements as local production adapted to overseas demand. None of this changed in a single moment. It changed in steps, each one described as necessary. By the early 19th century, the pattern was clear. The company governed millions of people. It collected revenue like a state. It controlled territory like a state. It commanded armies like a state. But it was not a state. It ruled without becoming a kingdom. It influenced Britain without being Britain. Bengal stood at the center of that paradox. The turning point did not end with the Battle of Plassey. The years that followed solidified the change. Trade became rule. Guidance became governance. Protection became authority. The company had become something new. Its officials continued to insist that their presence stabilized the region, that without them Bengal would fall into disorder. The justification remained the same even when reality changed around it. Rule was explained as responsibility. But the turning point had already passed. In 1757, the balance shifted. And Bengal would never be the same. Civilization as a mission takes shape between 1760 and 1830, during the heart of the Industrial Revolution. New machines roar to life in Britain, powering factories and reshaping society. Cities swell with workers seeking wages in a world of coal, iron, and invention. The pace of change is relentless, and with it comes a new idea. Britain is not simply advancing at home. It is leading the world forward. As the empire expands, this belief becomes a justification. They claim that the empire brings development to places it controls. Railways are described as more than transportation. They are described as symbols of improvement. Schools are described as more than education. They are described as instruments of advancement. Bureaucracy, courts, and administrative reforms are presented as evidence of a mission rather than authority. This belief is powerful. It allows conquest to be framed as assistance. It allows intervention to be described as guidance. It transforms political decisions into narratives of purpose. The empire becomes linked to the idea of civilization. The language of governance changes. Words like improvement, enlightenment, and progress begin to appear side by side with territorial expansion. Railways built to transport resources and military units are presented as gifts of modern transport. New docks constructed to increase exports are described as engines of prosperity. Schools established to teach British language and administrative systems are framed as pathways to advancement. In speeches, letters, and newspapers, Britain adopts a voice not of conquest, but of leadership. The mission is presented as noble, even when its effects are complex and uneven. This shift in perspective shapes how the empire sees itself. It reinforces the belief that expansion is justified if it claims to elevate rather than dominate. It gives administrators an idea they can carry with them across oceans. It gives merchants and investors a sense of purpose behind their economic interests. It gives the public at home a comforting explanation for distant decisions. Empires throughout history have justified themselves in many ways. During this era, Britain does so through the lens of civilization. Yet beneath the language of progress, realities on the ground are not always as harmonious as the narrative claims. Railways serve commerce and control as much as development. Schools often prioritize British systems over local traditions. Administrative reforms restructure societies without always understanding local needs. Progress is uneven. Benefits are not equally shared. But the mission continues because the belief behind it is seen as greater than its cost. In India, new institutions appear. Courts and councils are restructured to match British forms of governance. English education grows in cities. Rail lines begin to connect regions that were once separated by days of travel. Each change is explained as a step toward improvement. In Africa and the Caribbean, ports expand to support trade. Medical stations and missionary schools emerge alongside commercial interests. The idea of civilization becomes part of official language. As these changes spread, the concept of the civilizing mission becomes embedded in policy and administration. It influences decisions in London and in colonial capitals. It affects how people in Britain understand their place in the world. The mission justifies building new networks and rearranging old ones. It justifies treaties and interventions. It shapes the rules that govern trade, territory, and cultural exchange. This does not mean the idea is universally accepted. Some question its assumptions. Some resist the changes imposed by foreign systems. But in the heart of the Industrial Revolution, the voices that promote civilization as a mission are louder than the ones that challenge it. The empire moves forward powered by steam and confidence. By the 1820s, the belief is deeply established. It appears in printed works sold in markets. It is spoken in the halls of Parliament. It is written into letters sent from colonial officers to London. Even when technologies change and industries evolve, the idea remains. Empire is not only about territory or wealth. It is about claiming to bring civilization. This narrative will shape more than one century. It will influence policy into the Victorian age. It will justify railways, telegraphs, and administrative reforms that stretch across continents. It will follow the empire as it grows, and it will remain even as the empire begins to decline. The mission becomes part of the memory of expansion. Between 1760 and 1830, Britain transforms economically and technologically. Steam engines spin the wheels of industry. New cities rise around factories. Ports fill with cargo bound for distant places. Amid this transformation, the belief emerges that Britain is not simply growing but guiding. Not simply expanding but elevating. It becomes a story told to explain the spread of power. A story that shapes how empire sees itself. Civilization as a mission is both idea and instrument. It frames conquest as development. It presents authority as improvement. It gives the empire a story it can carry into the future. The world continues to change. The empire continues to grow. And the idea of civilization as a mission follows it, shaping decisions long after the first rails are laid and the first factories roar to life. Religious and moral claims 1780 to 1850 begins in an age of conviction. Between the late 18th century and the middle of the 19th, Britain experienced a wave of religious and social reform. Churches, missionary societies, abolitionist groups, and philanthropic organizations gained influence at home and abroad. Many reformers believed deeply that moral improvement, education, and spiritual guidance could change the world. Their intentions varied, but their impact became tied to the expanding reach of empire. Missionaries traveled to colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, carrying not just scripture but ideas about society, law, and daily life. Some worked to build schools and translate texts, others attempted to reshape local customs. They preached messages of transformation and wrote reports describing the people and landscapes they encountered. Their accounts flowed back to Britain, where they influenced public opinion and connected the spiritual mission to imperial interests. Reformers in Britain spoke passionately about the need to confront practices they viewed as harmful or unjust in distant territories. They argued that British presence could prevent suffering, encourage education, or restrict exploitation. Many believed they were contributing to positive change. Their campaigns filled newspapers, rallies, and political debates. Their voices reached Parliament, where their calls for moral duty blended with arguments for strategic control. This created a powerful narrative. The message suggested that empire was not just expansion. It was responsibility. Not merely authority, but obligation. A belief formed that British rule was necessary to guide others toward progress, even if those others had not asked to be guided. The idea strengthened a political structure already rooted in trade, military presence, and administrative power. For imperial officials, the moral argument offered a shield. It framed colonial rule as benevolence rather than domination. It allowed policymakers to defend expansion by presenting it as protection. Reports emphasized improvement rather than control. Language softened the reality of authority. Instead of speaking of conquest, they spoke of guardianship. Instead of ownership, they spoke of stewardship. The moral argument supported the political argument. In speeches, officials described imperial presence as a civilizing force. Maps drawn in London imagined territories not as independent societies, but as regions awaiting guidance. The complexities of existing cultures were reduced to narratives of deficiency. The structure of empire became easier to justify when cast in spiritual or humanitarian terms. It offered reassurance to those in Britain who questioned the cost of expansion. If the empire brought moral improvement, then its presence could be seen as necessary. Yet the situation was more complicated in practice. Some missionaries found themselves caught between empathy and authority. They witnessed the realities of colonial administration and struggled to reconcile them with their ideals. They saw hardship that could not be explained away by the language of duty. Their letters and journals show moments of doubt, compassion, and conflict. They reveal that not all who traveled believed the empire had the answers it claimed to hold. In some regions, missionary schools offered new education that changed how communities viewed the world. Children learned to read, write, and communicate in new languages. This opened doors to opportunity for some, and disruption for others. Traditions challenged by reform did not disappear. They persisted quietly or adapted to survive. The process was not uniform. It was uneven, shaped by geography, culture, and resistance. In other places, moral arguments influenced policy. Debates about abolition and reform forced governments to confront decisions that changed the nature of empire. The abolition of the British slave trade in 1807. And the later abolition of slavery in British territories in 1833 were connected to these conversations. Yet the economic systems shaped by earlier decades continued to exist, changed but not undone. Through all of this, the moral claim remained an anchor. It did not define every action of the empire. But it supported the structure that made those actions possible. It allowed expansion to appear righteous. It made governance seem like service. It told a story that Britain was not taking control, but fulfilling a duty. This identity filtered into social spaces. London drawing rooms echoed with discussions about spiritual purpose. Country estates displayed books about distant lands beside maps labeled with administrative borders. Church meetings raised funds for missions while newspapers published accounts of progress overseas. Even those who never traveled came to believe they were part of something necessary. Empire was not simply power. It was responsibility. But responsibility did not erase the impact. Land changed hands. Legal systems replaced existing structures. Cultural pressures reshaped identity. People lived through struggle and loss as reform and rule worked together, one offering justification, the other authority. The belief that Britain carried a moral obligation shaped policies that would last long after the reformers themselves were gone. Between 1780 and 1850, religious conviction and imperial ambition became intertwined. They formed a partnership of intention and consequence. One argued for salvation. The other argued for control. Together, they built a story powerful enough to sustain expansion. The moral argument supported the political argument. Empire gained structure from faith and justification from conscience. And in that partnership, a legacy was created that still raises questions today. Military occupation as protection 1800 to 1857. The empire is not here to rule, they say. In this era, conquest is not spoken of as expansion. Speeches, dispatches, and official letters echo the empire's claim. In this era, conquest is not spoken of as expansion. It is described as protection. The empire is not here to protect, but to rule. Campaigns are launched and presented as defensive actions. When British armies enter a region, the explanation is consistent. They are responding to disorder. They are preventing foreign rivals from gaining ground. They are protecting trade, allies, or strategic territory. Marches across plains and coasts are framed as necessary. Garrisons appear around ports, passes, and cities described as too important to leave exposed. The presence of soldiers is justified not by ambition, but by warning. In India, military expansion follows a similar pattern. Treaties signed in negotiation halls lead to soldiers stationed in nearby forts. Advisors placed at courts eventually speak with more authority than the rulers they advise. Conflicts between kingdoms become opportunities for intervention. Rivalries are described as instability. Instability requires control. Control, once in place, becomes hard to reverse. Each step is explained as a response to danger, even when the danger is difficult to define. The empire argues that its presence prevents the world from falling into disorder. That without its intervention, rival powers would seize control. That without its troops, local conflicts would spiral. That without its administration, trade and travel would collapse. This argument becomes the shield behind which expansion grows. This becomes the language that turns marching columns into guardians, and occupation into duty. Across the African coast, forts rise beside ports where officials claim to protect trade routes from interference. Patrols move along rivers and roads, carrying the message that British presence prevents rivals from entering or returning. Even when the forts expand and troops increase, the message does not change. These are not tools of conquest, but instruments of safety. In Asia, strategic waterways and harbors attract similar attention. Naval squadrons appear off coastlines with the stated goal of preventing external threats. Landing parties take control of settlements considered vital to regional security. Maps change slowly, and then suddenly. Each adjustment is explained as temporary. Each temporary measure becomes routine. Local leaders face a narrowing of choices. Some cooperate, believing cooperation offers security or advantage. Some resist, hoping to protect sovereignty. Others attempt to negotiate, trapped between their own authority and the expectations placed upon them. Whichever path they choose, the outcome often leads to the same result. British troops remain. Advisors remain. Influence becomes presence. Presence becomes rule. The idea of protection reshapes public opinion in Britain as well. Reports in newspapers describe distant regions as unstable and in need of guidance. Victory is framed as relief. Occupation is framed as responsibility. The empire's critics are answered with claims that withdrawal would lead to chaos. Voices calling for expansion are replaced with voices calling for stability, though the result is much the same. The logic of military occupation becomes cyclical. Conflict is used to justify intervention. Intervention is used to justify continued presence. Continued presence is used to justify authority. Authority is used to justify the next campaign. Protection becomes a narrative that explains every step, even those that move beyond protection into control. The line between assistance and dominance fades. Soldiers stationed in forts and cantonments live inside this narrative as well. Marching orders refer to peacekeeping. Garrison routines are described as safeguarding. Officers report home that they are preventing disorder, not enforcing rule. Letters sent to London emphasize duty rather than ambition. The empire presents itself as the stabilizing force in a world defined by risk. But the presence of troops has consequences. In some regions, traditional systems of government weaken as military authority takes precedence. Courts and councils lose influence. Decisions once made locally are reviewed by officials who answer to distant offices. Laws shift to align with imperial priorities. The landscape of power changes, often faster than communities can respond. Stability arrives with a cost. By the 1850s, this pattern is deeply rooted. The empire claims that its occupation prevents collapse. That without garrisons and fleets, rivals would invade. That without oversight, local disputes would ignite. That the world needs guardianship. The language of duty becomes as important as the soldiers who carry it. Conquest becomes framed as stability. In India, tension grows as military presence deepens. Competing beliefs and economic strain collide with authority imposed from elsewhere. The system built on protection will soon face its most serious test. In 1857, resistance erupts, revealing that stability enforced by foreign power is not the same as stability accepted by those who live under it. The Centuria's logic reaches breaking point. The argument of security fractures. Looking back from this moment, the era between 1800 and 1857 becomes clear. It is not only a period of expansion. It is a period where expansion was explained, justified, and reshaped into language that sounded necessary. The empire did not claim conquest. It claimed protection. It did not claim dominance. It claimed responsibility. The story was not told in the language of ambition, but in the language of guardianship. Yet beneath that language, the reality remained. Military occupation may have been described as protection, but it created systems where decisions were no longer made by those who lived with their consequences. It imposed order by defining who held authority. It changed not only borders, but futures. The argument that without empire, the world would fall apart. This is the legacy of the era. Between 1880 and 1914, the map of Africa changed at a pace faster than any time before. The era became known for treaties, negotiations, and agreements drafted as formal contracts. On paper, these documents claimed cooperation. They claimed partnership. They claimed protection. But the circumstances in which they were signed revealed a different reality. Some leaders negotiated to preserve what they could. Others signed under pressure, or with incomplete understanding of the legal consequences. Many agreements were written in languages not spoken by those who were asked to accept them. Authority shifted not through open conflict alone, but through paperwork that redefined control. The scramble for Africa was never just a race for land. It was a race for legitimacy. Each treaty offered a kind of legal shield for expansion. British officials presented documents as instruments of order, a way to prove that new borders and administrative systems had consent. But these signatures did not always reflect equal terms. The balance of power was uneven from the first page to the last. Some agreements promised protection from rival powers. Some promised trade access, roads, or weapons. Others promised security in exchange for influence. What sounded like partnership in London could feel like surrender on the ground. Maps became the physical outcome of these agreements. They were often drafted thousands of miles away, in meeting rooms far removed from the landscapes they described. Borders were drawn as straight lines across deserts, forests, and river valleys. These lines did not follow languages, cultures, or histories. They followed strategy. They marked ports, trade routes, and points of resource extraction. They ensured that territory connected to railways, harbors, and commercial outposts that served imperial priorities. Cartographers and politicians stood over maps as if they were architects of a world that could be measured by ruler and ink. Cartographers and politicians stood over maps as if they were architects of a world that could be measured by ruler and ink. In many cases, treaty signing began with diplomatic visits. British representatives arrived with translators, advisors, and formal proposals. They carried documents written to sound neutral and administrative. Leaders who met them faced decisions shaped by pressure. If they refused, neighboring powers might accept. If they hesitated, military presence might increase. If they attempted to negotiate, the terms remained defined by foreign interests. Cooperation was encouraged, but the alternatives hovered in the background. The decision was rarely free of consequence. One of the arguments used to support these agreements was protection. Protection of trade routes from rivals. Protection of borders from encroachment. Protection of coastal access that connected inland territories to global markets. Officials spoke of safeguarding stability, as if control were a preventative measure rather than an expansion. Protection became a justification, repeated in correspondence and official reports. It framed intervention as necessary. It turned presence into authority. It gave expansion the appearance of obligation rather than choice. Communication networks played a role in this transformation. Telegraph lines carried information from African ports to Europe in hours instead of weeks. Decisions made on distant frontiers traveled to government offices and returned as directives. Agreements did not stand alone. They were supported by infrastructure that reinforced control. Every new track laid or cable installed made the treaties harder to reverse. In coastal cities, the effects of the agreements appeared quickly. New buildings rose to house officials and financial offices. Ports expanded. Customs houses monitored cargo. Goods once exchanged between neighboring communities began to move outward, toward distant markets. Inland regions felt the impact in subtler ways. Taxation systems changed. Land ownership laws were rewritten. Traditional authority structures were pressed to adapt to systems introduced from outside. Resistance followed these changes, sometimes immediately and sometimes after years of tension. Leaders who signed agreements attempted to preserve autonomy within the limits the documents imposed. Others rejected the terms and confronted the authority behind them. Some regions pushed against new borders that divided communities. Promised trade opportunities did not always arrive with equal benefit. Promised security did not always provide stability. In Britain, the treaties were recorded in archives and announced in newspapers. They were framed as achievements of diplomacy. Proof that expansion could occur without open conflict. They supported the narrative that empire operated through law rather than imposition. In Africa, the consequences were lived rather than archived. Authority shifted on the ground. Markets changed direction. Governance took new forms. The difference between the paper agreement and the daily outcome became one of the central features of the period. By the early 20th century, the age of agreements had left its mark across the continent. Borders drawn in London shaped political futures long after the ink dried. Trade routes defined by foreign priorities influenced economies for generations. The language of protection evolved into the structure of administration. What had begun as treaties became foundations for rule. This era revealed that power can be transferred without armies crossing every border. It can be signed across a table. It can be agreed to under pressure. It can be written into documents that contain more authority than the voices that accepted them. Expansion did not always arrive with conquest. Sometimes it arrived with contracts that promised stability while preparing the way for control. Between 1880 and 1914, Africa entered an age where agreements became instruments of empire. They transformed negotiation into authority. They turned signatures into borders. And they showed that the language of cooperation could mask the reality of unequal terms. Shaping a continent from afar. The education argument 1850 to 1900. Between 1850 and 1900, the empire entered a period defined not only by territory and trade, but by influence over ideas. In colonized regions across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, a new frontier of control emerged. Schools were established. Curricula were rewritten. Universities opened their doors with new priorities. The goal, officials claimed, was progress. English became a language of government. It appeared in courtrooms, administrative offices, and legal documents. Local languages were not banned, but they were often pushed to the margins. Authority began to speak with a different accent. The empire argued that a shared language allowed communication, modern governance, and new opportunity. But for many, it also marked the first step in redefining identity. British law entered court systems as the official foundation for decisions. It replaced older structures that had guided local disputes for generations. Judges and administrators trained in new legal codes made rulings according to unfamiliar rules. Where traditional systems once settled conflicts through custom and community, the colonial courts imposed precedent and paperwork. The empire described this as modernization, a step toward global standards. Others saw it as displacement. Schools built during this period taught grammar, arithmetic, geography, and history through a British lens. Textbooks framed the empire as a model of order. Lessons emphasized the benefits of imperial guidance. Students learned more about global trade than local heritage. They learned more about distant monarchs than nearby leaders. The system did not erase what came before, but it reshaped it quietly, lesson by lesson. Universities created under colonial administration trained clerks, administrators, and translators. These graduates became intermediaries between local populations and the state. They filled government jobs, managed paperwork, and communicated policy. The empire pointed to them as evidence that it was sharing knowledge. But it also benefited from a workforce trained to support its structure. Education became not just learning, but recruitment. For Britain, these institutions served as proof. They were presented as improvements, investments, and gifts. They showed that the empire built railways, hospitals, and schools. Officials spoke of raising standards, encouraging development, and introducing new opportunities. Education, they said, was a pathway to advancement. It justified presence. It justified power. It made rule appear not only rational but benevolent. But in many places, the cost was subtle. Local systems of learning lost authority. Oral traditions, regional scholarship, and cultural knowledge were treated as secondary. Students learned literature that came from abroad, while their own stories were described as folk memory. Libraries filled with imported texts, while local manuscripts faded from use. What had once shaped identities became artifacts of the past. Communities felt the shift in daily routines. Parents encouraged their children to attend new schools because the future seemed to require it. Language changed at dinner tables. Professional success often required distance from older ways of life. Some families welcomed the possibilities. Others felt the weight of what was being replaced. Progress became a negotiation between gain and loss. In cities, elite institutions produced graduates who believed in reform through imperial channels. In rural regions, traditional teachers struggled to maintain their roles. Two systems overlapped uneasily, neither fully replacing the other. The empire used this overlap to justify its presence. Look at the schools. Look at the courts. Look at the knowledge we have shared. These were the arguments of the age. It was not a simple story. Education did create opportunity. Some students used it to pursue positions of leadership, and to challenge the empire from within. New knowledge allowed new voices to emerge. Newspapers, political movements, and reform campaigns grew from the very tools the empire introduced. In that sense, education empowered resistance as much as compliance. The empire had given people the vocabulary to question it. But the core tension remained. Were these institutions built to strengthen colonized societies? Or were they built to shape them? The empire described education as advancement. Many who experienced it understood it differently. They saw the boundaries of what they were allowed to become. They saw how certain lessons encouraged loyalty rather than inquiry. They saw how the system rewarded those who adapted and left behind those who did not. Britain justified influence by pointing to what it had built. Schools, colleges, libraries, and legal codes became exhibits in a case for legitimacy. The narrative said that guidance was necessary, that the empire was preparing its territories for the future. The narrative said that education was a gift. But for many, it felt like something else. It felt like redirection. It felt like replacement. It felt like being overridden. By 1900, the education argument had become central to imperial identity. The empire no longer claimed rule by conquest alone. It claimed rule through teaching. It claimed rule through improvement. But beneath that claim lay a contradiction. Teaching and replacing are not the same. Guidance and authority are not the same. Advancement and control are not the same. The empire said it was educating. Others felt they were being rewritten. Between 1850 and 1900, classrooms became battlegrounds for identity, authority, and the future. And the cost of knowledge was not always measured in books, but in what was left behind. Resistance and the collapse of justification unfold between 1857 and 1947. The empire enters this period believing it can explain its presence through ideas of protection, governance, and improvement. It claims to offer stability, progress, and the benefits of modernization. But across decades, resistance grows. Movements rise. Voices demand accountability. The justifications that once held power together begin to fracture. The year 1857 marks an challenges British authority and exposes the limits of crown rule. What had been described as a system of order is revealed to be far more fragile. After the conflict, Britain tightens control, reforms administration, and builds networks of governance meant to prevent such uprisings from happening again. Railways expand. Telegraph lines connect distant stations to central command. New policies reshape land, law, and education. But the memory of resistance remains. It becomes a reference point for future generations. A reminder that control is never absolute. Over time, new forms of resistance appear. They are not always armed. They are not always sudden. Some movements grow through speeches and writing. Others through community organization, legal petitions, or demands for representation. Protests begin to form in African regions influenced by British rule. Local leaders challenge export systems that prioritize imperial markets over local needs. Workers resist economic policies that devalue their labor. These actions question the idea that empire brings prosperity. In the Caribbean, voices rise to challenge inequality embedded in plantation economies and colonial administration. Writers, educators, and activists demand new rights. Their arguments are rooted not in rejection of progress, but in rejection of systems that deny autonomy. They ask why improvement must come from outside. Why progress cannot be shaped by the people who live in the lands where it is meant to take hold. These questions carry weight. They echo across oceans. By the early 20th century, resistance movements become more coordinated. Newspapers spread ideas. Associations and congresses form to debate political futures. Britain attempts to preserve authority through negotiation and reform, but every concession acknowledges that the structure of rule is shifting. Even as colonial governments enact new policies, the underlying belief in imperial permanence begins to fade. Then the First World War arrives. People from across the empire serve in the conflict. And many return home expecting political recognition. They ask what victory means if it does not include the right to shape their own governments. If conquest was protection, why must those protected fight for the empire without gaining equality afterward? If rule was improvement, why does improvement not include representation? These questions challenge the foundational claims of empire more directly than ever before. In the decades that follow, pressure continues to build. Protests grow larger. Leaders emerge who articulate visions of independence. They frame change not as decline, but as the next step in national development. Britain faces a reality that cannot be answered by infrastructure, legislation, or reform alone. The logic of empire is strained. The Second World War becomes the final blow to imperial certainty. Britain emerges victorious but weakened. Economies are strained. Cities are damaged. The cost of maintaining global authority is no longer sustainable. The people who resisted now stand with stronger arguments. The empire cannot defend itself as a force for improvement while so many demand the right to leave. In India, organized movements challenge the core justification of British rule. They argue that governance without consent is not protection. That improvement without equality is not progress. That rule must end. Negotiations intensify. London realizes that holding the subcontinent by force would break the post-war future it hopes to build. Independence becomes inevitable. When India gains independence in 1947, the collapse of justification becomes undeniable. The departure of the empire's central possession sends a message across the globe. If the mission of civilization and improvement were as permanent as claimed, why was departure necessary? If the empire were universally accepted, why did so many celebrate its end? The questions become answers in themselves. In Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, independence movements accelerate. Each new transition further weakens the narrative that empire exists for the benefit of those it governs. The explanations that once defended territorial expansion no longer align with the world that is emerging. Words cannot hold an empire that no longer fits its age. Resistance did not destroy the empire in a single moment. It eroded it year by year, demand by demand, movement by movement. It exposed the distance between justification and reality. It revealed how fragile the idea of permanent rule truly was. By 1947, the collapse of explanation is complete. The empire cannot continue by insisting it is needed when so many insist it is not. Between 1857 and 1947, resistance reshapes the world. It transforms subjects into citizens. Colonies into nations. Administration into negotiation. The age of imperial certainty fades. A new age begins, built on the demands of those who challenged the stories used to justify power. The justifications fall away. The empire loses the narrative it once relied on. Words could not hold it forever. After empire ends begins in a moment of change. The world that had been mapped and administered from London was shifting toward independence. Nations that had lived under colonial authority began to claim their sovereignty. India in 1947. Ghana in 1957. Nigeria in 1960. Each independence movement marked a turning point, not only in geography and law, but in identity. As flags were lowered and new ones raised, relationships between Britain and its former colonies transformed. The language that had once described empire as improvement or protection began to fade. In its place came the language of partnership, transition, and cooperation. Officials spoke of support rather than oversight. Progress instead of guardianship. The story of empire was being rewritten, not with triumph, but with adjustment. For Britain, independence meant an end to old certainties. Trade no longer flowed automatically through imperial channels. Overseas administrations closed. Military bases scaled back. Diplomats replaced governors. The empire that had once seemed permanent now existed only in memory, archives, and architecture. A new path was required at home, one that no longer relied on the structures of colonial rule. For newly independent nations, the end of empire did not mean an immediate break with the past. Constitutions were drafted. Parliaments assembled. Borders drawn during imperial rule became the borders of modern states. Legal systems adapted to serve new governments. Railways, ports, and administrative buildings built for empire became the foundations of new national infrastructure. The next step forward began with what had already been left behind. In cities across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, independence arrived with hope and uncertainty in equal measure. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Anthems filled the air. People spoke of possibilities that had once seemed unreachable. How to unite communities divided by lines drawn on maps. How to shape identity after generations of being defined by another power. The consequences of empire did not disappear with independence. They remained in the structure of markets, where exports still traveled along familiar routes. They remained in official languages used for government and education. They remained in borders that had not been chosen by geography or history, but drawn by negotiation and policy. They remained in debates about land, law, and belonging. Independence brought authority. It did not erase complexity. Britain changed too. Without empire, it needed a new purpose in the world. London became a center of global finance. Cultural exchange replaced colonial administration. Immigration reshaped cities, as families from former colonies arrived to begin new lives. They brought languages, traditions, skills, and histories. Their presence reflected the world that empire created, not through force, but through movement. The connection no longer rested on rule. It rested on people. In this new era, Britain no longer used the language that once defended its presence overseas. Improvement, protection, and duty became words of the past. Instead, there were discussions of diplomacy. Agreements between equals. Shared membership in organizations rather than control from afar. The shift did not undo history. It acknowledged that history had already changed. Independence did not end the relationships formed under empire. It altered them. They negotiated trade deals rather than receiving commands. They sent ambassadors instead of petitions. They wrote their own laws, their own futures, their own narratives. Some nations thrived quickly. Others struggled against challenges rooted in the systems left behind. Each path was different, shaped by choices made before and after independence. As the 20th century progressed, conversation replaced justification. Reflection replaced rhetoric. Historians examined archives. Citizens shared personal memories. New generations asked questions that previous generations did not. Museums reconsidered what they displayed. Textbooks updated what they taught. The past became something to understand rather than defend. The justifications faded. The consequences remained. In many places, the legacy of empire is visible in the shape of cities. Government buildings built in a foreign architectural style still stand. Ports constructed for trade still handle cargo. Railways designed to move resources still carry passengers. The physical imprint of empire endures even when the authority behind it is gone. In other places, the legacy is intangible. It exists in the structure of a legal code. In the design of a school curriculum. In the holidays, ceremonies, and customs that survived adaptation. It lives not in monuments, but in memory. History cannot be undone. But it can be understood. Understanding does not change what happened. It changes how the present responds. It allows nations to recognize the patterns that shaped them. It allows societies to see the parts of history that remain hidden. It allows individuals to ask where they stand in the story, and how that story continues. After empire ends, what remains is not a clean break, but a transition. A world built on contact, conflict, exchange, and adaptation does not dissolve. It transforms. The final chapter of empire was not a collapse. It was a shift from direct rule to global interdependence. A shift from possession to negotiation. A shift from authority to memory. The empire ended. The world it shaped did not. And history continues, not as a conclusion, but as a question carried into the future. Thank you for listening and being part of this journey. The story of how Britain justified conquest is not only about the past. It is about words, ideas, and beliefs. It is a reminder that power is not only built by force. Sometimes, it is built by explanation. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and take care.